Hey everybody, my name is Ian. I work at the Fort Worth Public Library, and this is our Maker Showcase interview. Remember that we do the Maker Showcase interviews every second Saturday of the month. I'm excited today because I have a photographer with me for today's Maker Showcase interview. Let's say hello to Chris Ossenfort.
Hi everybody, pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to get to speak with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know that there are going to be a lot of people who are already interested in photography, and this is going to be a great way to talk about it. So let's start off with your maker talent. Obviously, it's photography. So go ahead and talk a little bit about what you do as a photographer.
So I actually do quite a few maker things. I need the creative outlet. I do woodworking, and I used to do a bit more drawing, but mainly photography is my full-time outlet, and it's my full-time life and career. But the photography of mine that pays the bills and does the work for me is advertising and a touch of fashion. So I work for companies like Fossil and a couple of shoe companies and other product producing companies, and I market and come up with their ad campaigns as far as producing the photography or some of the other aspects of it. But I do a good bit of advertisements that you would see at the airport or on a billboard or in signage in stores or in email blasts or any of those things. So there's a good chance you've seen my photography out in the world, but wouldn't necessarily recognize it to be mine.
Yeah, I was actually about to say, I probably have seen some of your work already and just never knew it. So you do this commercial work, but you also, it sounds like, enjoy doing some maybe hobby photography or some other type of photography as well?
Absolutely. So a lot of the commercial jobs that I get to work on have very laid out, predetermined, organized parameters that we go and execute a concept. We'll go and photograph this idea. And quite often those are very exciting and complex and fun creative projects, but quite often they're also the client needs this shot on white or this shot that's very generic and it's just a lifestyle happy moment. And you do a lot of those, and those can feel a bit more like work and less like creating or being creative. And while you're still creative and artistic product, while you're still working on an artistic product, you're not necessarily expressing yourself in a lot of ways. And perhaps it'll be the art director has the majority of creative control in that situation. So for myself, I like to step aside and do what's known in the photography industry as testing or just portfolio work, where I'll just go off and do my own personal shoots or come up with a concept and execute at home or something of that nature. Or when I'm traveling, I feel like I have a lot more freedom to define the rules of what I'm doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. What is your favorite subject or thing to photograph?
People. It's definitely on figure. It is what we would call it for product. Like if we were selling a watch or a shirt or something, it's on the figure of the person. But it's really moments that are expressions of emotion or where you look at the image and you can kind of get a sense of what they're feeling or maybe I don't want to say fantasy because that's its own realm of photography, but I want advertising to be something that you want to strive to, like a fantastic goal, like an aesthetic or a relaxing scene or a moment that you want to be in. So I'd like to create that. Those are my ideal moments when I'm creating an environment or a look or a feel that people want to gravitate towards or wish to be like. So
That's really
cool. Hold me towards photography or advertising, I should say.
Yeah. So how did you get started? Was this something that you were growing up and went to college for, or did this happen happenstance?
A little bit of both. I grew up, a lot of my parents' friends were artists, painters, sculptors, and things of that nature. So there was a lot of art around me. And I grew up drawing a lot. It was basically most weekends I'd be sitting around just drawing from pictures in magazines or pictures I'd find anywhere. And this is middle school, high school age. And as I got better, I never quite got good, but as I got better, I really kind of started getting the feeling that if I executed a drawing really well, if I pulled it off perfectly, it's still not my idea if I'm drawing from a photograph that wasn't mine. So I wanted to have more control over the entire process. So I thought to myself very, very naively and egotistically that I'll run out and get a camera and I'll just take the cool photos myself. And then it'll be my art that I'm recreating as a drawing. And I saved up a little bit and I went and got a camera. I think I was probably just barely 16. And halfway through, it was back in film, to date me a bit, but halfway through my first roll of film, I realized that I absolutely love how complicated and chaotic and everything about photography that I knew of at the moment. And I realized that make or break, I was going to be doing that forever. And it was kind of one of those moments that really sent me on a course, because as my friends were trying to figure out what they wanted to do in college and trying to figure out what they wanted to do with their careers and their lives, I never really went through that because I knew I was going to be doing photography. Other jobs might be there to support me along the way, but for the most part, I was striving and aiming to do photography in some capacity, and I just pushed towards that the entire time.
Wow.
That clarity was rare amongst my group of friends.
Yeah, that's for sure. I know a lot of people who have struggled in college trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up. And I definitely had a few moments of wondering what I was going to do. So that's very impressive that you already knew exactly kind of what you were going to end up doing. As you were going through college, what kind of classes did you end up taking?
I did a lot of core classes in my local junior college, and then I ended up going to a photography school in New England. And it was very photo focused. So it was a lot more technical detail and understanding the process of photography. And I do regret to some degree that at this point, if I were to choose which classes again to go through, I would lean much more towards business or marketing of some kind, just so that like the talent of photography comes and goes. The common saying is you'll learn more on your first day on set than you will in years in a school. And its actual application is always going to be a better teacher than anything you can read or practice or try in a book. Like actually doing the job is going to get you much further than the classroom. But that's not to say the classroom is not necessary. What a lot of photographers, and myself included, struggle with is business and or marketing or things of that nature. And I find that if I had a solid ground, because when you're a photographer, it may be art, but you have to run a business to make the business of photography successful. So I find that if I had a stronger foundation in marketing or business, I would probably have had an easier go of becoming successful.
Yeah, I didn't even think about having to kind of balance that artistic side, but also operating your business and being able to do all those business contracts and all the important things that need to happen.
There's so many contracts, and it's just not a natural thought process for a creative mind sometimes to sit here and have to negotiate the price value of the time versus the price value of the image and everything, and how and what uses they can have. It's like all of those litigious practices seem very, very cumbersome to somebody who just wants to pick up a camera and do photography. So it would, like I said, it would be very helpful to have that as a little trick in my back pocket.
Definitely. A lot of times makers don't think about how much time how much value their time has and how to put a dollar amount on it to be able to offer their services. I know as a maker myself, there are times that I get asked to work projects or create projects for other people, and I don't know how much of a dollar value to put on it because I just don't know. So those are important things to keep in mind. Now, in college, I ended up taking 2 photography classes as electives. I really enjoyed it a lot. I worked with film as well. In mine, I'm wondering, did you also end up taking classes where you're ending up developing your own film and doing that kind of thing?
We definitely had film processing classes and printing and the full darkroom experience. It was the digital photography it either only barely existed or didn't exist when I was in school, and it was coming out in the next couple of years, but the medium was clunky at the time, and it wasn't exactly anything you shoot on your phone is is 30 times better photo than you were ever going to get off of a digital camera that was out then. So film was very much the standard industry-wide still. So yeah, there were definitely several classes on black and white processing of film, color processes, and different kinds of color negatives, and treating the film differently to get different results from it. A lot of the stuff that you would do in Photoshops or in Instagram filters, you actually could do to the film. There's this one technique called cross-processing where you actually intentionally use the wrong chemicals, like that were intended for a different process, and it made everything really contrasty and really colorful. And it was a cool technique, but it can be gimmicky unless you use it exactly right. So there was a lot of hours in the dark room, and it's funny we talk about retouching and things like that as though they're very, very new concepts, but Ainsley Adams is famous for basically learning how to use just certain parts of certain images. And that's why his images are so beautiful, of like the national parks everywhere, is he pulls the really bright spots from this picture and he pulls the really dark spots from this picture, and he makes sure he has a full range of tonal values. And it's kind of the original retouching is like slowly selecting what you want to let come into the image in the darkroom.
Oh man, I'm remembering my time in the dark room, and it's almost zen-like, where you put in your music, you get into the chemicals, and you start processing and developing, and it's such a fun process. I remember that a lot. It's a lot of fun.
There's definitely a calm, a stepping away from everything else in life and just being there.
Yeah, definitely. Something about the darkness and then the red light, and it's crazy. It's an amazing place. But anyways, enough about my experience. But no, it's really a great thing to be able to develop your own photos and really have control over them in a physical form. What are some differences between digital and physical?
The most obvious and in your face one is you have the image right there immediately. When we were shooting film, the first, I was a photo assistant before I was a photographer, and the first film was still the primary tool of the industry until probably the second or third year I was shooting, and I assisted probably for 3 to 5 years, probably closer to 5. So there's that 7-8 year window in which we were still using film for everything, and there were a lot less photographers. I mean, an overwhelming amount of less photographers in the industry, because the knowledge and confidence that you have to do a shoot that costs the client a lot of money for models and hair, makeup and props and location and everything that goes into one of those photo shoots, to not have the images in hand until the next morning when the lab's done processing the negatives, and to know that you got that shot and you can move on. You have to know exactly what you're doing and how you're doing it, and you have to know what every light or the sun or everything that you're controlling is doing. And if you're wrong, the images will turn out wrong, and clients aren't very forgiving of that. Now, the second you I use light meters from time to time still, just to tell me exactly what readings I'm getting all over the space. But for the most part, you can take a picture, look at it and say, I want it brighter over here. I want a little darker over here. I want this. So there's not as much stress at night when you're waiting for the lab to get back to you with the images to make sure that you actually got it right. There is no concern for that anymore. But this also opens the doors to a much broader audience of people that don't have to be technically sound on the front end. They can adjust in the flow of things. And the other side of it that I see is different is digital's not cheaper. If anything, I feel like it's more expensive, but it's not built in or thought of in the same way. So there's this waste area where it somehow costs the same or more to do digital photography, because cameras generationally go away. Where if I was shooting a digital camera from 2012, it's completely obsolete. But the Hasselblad and the Canon 81 that I started with, and the Mamiya that I started with, still is a perfectly good camera that can shoot film perfectly fine and would produce beautiful images. So that's 30-year-old, 40, actually the Hasselblad would be a 60-year-old camera now. So that can last 60 years and you don't have to replace your lenses and everything like that. Wherein now there's probably a 5-year shelf life on most cameras, five to six. And then another avenue of, like I said before, where you could take an image and look at it and say, okay, I do like this, I don't like this. And then you shoot another one. And you do like this or you don't like this. And then you shoot another one. I find that I watch people take a lot more images to get to the point where they're happy than they used to. Because before, the cost of the film and the cost of the time and the value of taking a Polaroid and things like that were budgeted in. And you would say, okay, we want to get it as close as possible up front, and then take a Polaroid and we'll make a couple of small adjustments. And then we'll take another Polaroid, but once we have that, we're moving forward. So you basically only get 1 or 2 chances to reset it. And now it's like, you take a frame, you make some adjustments, you take a frame, you make some adjustments, you take a frame, and so on and so forth. So I find that people are much more willing to change things throughout the process and not really dial them in up front as much.
Goodness gracious, this is a lot to process. Forgive the pun, but wow, that's really, I hadn't even thought about the digital waste, I guess, the how quickly things become obsolete and things move so quickly. I guess I should think about that, because my camera on my smartphone, we end up replacing that every 2, 3, maybe up to 5 years, but most of the time people replace them a lot faster than that. So I hadn't really thought about that factor.
Can you imagine the images you took on your Nokia or whatever the first phone that had a camera on it was?
Oh my gosh. Oh, well, first of all, my first phone didn't have a camera on it. Yeah. So, you go to today and it's every phone has a camera on it.
With multiple lenses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's crazy.
The generational differences are huge, but most people have more power in the camera in their pocket than we did from 2007 until 2013.
It's crazy to think about. So, now, who has inspired you, or where have you gotten inspiration or mentoring from?
Inside photography, I've had inspiration in multiple directions. I grew up loving the Rolling Stone photographers, Annie Leibovitz and Mark Seliger and people of that nature. And your portrait photographers, your Richard Avedons and Herb Ritts. I loved Herb Ritts in the 90s. His music videos and his styles were just overwhelming. But as I was coming of age, the chaos and colorful backgrounds that were happening in music videos really, really, really inspired a lot of my stuff. Like the Michael Crichton series, or just anything where they were pushing the boundaries of the technology of the day, and really, really playing with some interesting lighting concepts or interesting set designs, as opposed to just a very straightforward portrait. I always really appreciated those things. I grew up in a small town and didn't really have access to the concept of advertising or a lot of commercial photography as I know it today. And I perceived photography to mostly be journalism, and started out doing a lot, like I would work with the local newspapers or photograph local events and things like that. And I originally thought that my career path would be more journalistic, because those were the avenues. In my town, it was senior portraits or journalism, and very small journalism at that. But I kept going in that direction until meeting one of my heroes. And there's a photographer, Ainsley Adams, who had photographed this. It's a rather graphic image. I don't recommend pulling it up if you're younger or sensitive to such natures, but it's a war photograph. And it's a pretty frightening war photograph. And it's one of them from, I believe it was the Korean War, that brought a lot of media attention to the war. And it made people kind of stop down and think, what's actually happening here? And it was beautiful and one of those journalistic moments that is very needed, and the reason we have journalism. But I also found that when I finally got to meet him and be in his studio and work with him a bit, and then I met some other photojournalists, I realized that their best day or their most successful day is usually rooted in a major tragedy. And it almost became tragedy seeking, like, and not calling out them individually, but like, I don't want to run into the next Hurricane Katrina to hope to get my Pulitzer Prize winning shot. I don't want to go to a war zone to hope to get that moment. I don't want to hope for that moment. Like, I don't want my career to hinge on something tragic. And I totally understand journalism existing and desire for it to exist so that we have the truth in our media. But I didn't want that to be my life. So that steered me pretty quickly from that to models and hair and makeup and other people on beaches and places that were a little more serene and less warlike.
Yeah. Wow. That's a deep thought right there. And I hadn't thought about it in that way. So yeah, no, that's wow. I love these interviews. They usually get into this deep place. And I love that about these interviews. But that's very interesting to think about, and a good thing to think about if you're interested in going into journalism and thinking about what that looks like and everything that entails. Thankfully, there are some happier stories that are covered, but yeah, a lot of times it is more tragedy.
And less tragic versions of things. You can go into finance journalism. You can go into there's a million ways to cover it. But the images that drew me in, the Time magazine images, or those moments, generally were bigger historical moments that were brought on by bigger historical moments that you don't necessarily want to have been a part of.
Yeah, definitely. Now, if somebody is interested in getting into photography, obviously they don't want to rush out and buy the $1,600 camera out there. What can they do to get started? One thing before we get started on that answer is they can, of course, come to the library and check out a lot of different books that have photography subjects, and of course, how to use cameras and stuff like that. But what else can they do?
They're going to the library and getting the books is such a big key to it, because learning what photography is will make you be able to take a good photo with your phone, which most of you already have. If you understand what your phone's doing, then you can control what it's doing and how to do it. And if you have a phone already, then you can be you would be surprised how many major companies are requesting that shoots be done on phones so that they could be claimed that they are done on an iPhone or something of that nature. It's actually quite common to see entire shoots done on phone. It's not the industry standard by any stretch, but it does happen frequently. The image quality and image size, like I said, would rival most of the things that we were shooting in the late 2000s. So you have access to things around you. You have access to, you can go to a local pawn shop and get the used camera or the used thing or the film camera if you want to get vintage with it. And there are ways to go about that process that definitely doesn't have to start out at $1,600. And the only reason you would ever buy those tools is if you knew exactly what you were buying them for and specifically why. The tool won't make you better. It's knowing what you're doing that will make you better. And that knowledge comes from studying and practice and saying, okay, well, I know that I need this to be brighter. So maybe I need to fill it in with a piece of cardboard or paper or something. Like, let the light bounce off of that and just start looking around you and studying the light. When I'm sure everyone's noticed when light's bouncing off of a building and it's reflecting onto somebody and it's really pretty, or when you see light bouncing in weird ways, kind of just think about what it's actually doing. What's causing that moment to be so pretty? Is it a dark background and a bright foreground, or what in that moment is actually attracting you to look at it? These things, again, the learning and the practice are going to get you further than any high dollar gear will. And then knowing your gear, if you get it, if you know how the phone takes a picture, if you know what f-stop or what shutter speed or things like that, you can actually dial those things in and control your situation a lot better. So
that's awesome. It seems like photography these days is way more accessible and way more easy to get into and get started with.
It's absolutely universal, completely. I would always suggest start doing it as a hobby. And if you found that as a hobby you can't think of doing anything else, then consider making it a career. But don't go into it as a career up front.
That's good advice. That's
That,
really
that
good.
way you can learn to love it before you learn to commit to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day for this interview. I really appreciate it. And I know our audience appreciates it as well. Where can they find you online?
I have a website at chrisossenfort.com. I'm sure my name will be linked in the bio or the tag here for the spelling. Same thing for Instagram, Chris Ossenfort Photo or Ossenfort Photo. One's more product focused, one's more on figure focused. But those three places will find me, and feel free to reach out, email questions. If anyone has any photography questions, feel free to let me know.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Ian.
Awesome. Don't forget next month to come back for the Maker Showcase interview. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.